Bom, boa tarde. Estamos aqui na nossa segunda mesa de hoje, a mesa com Michael Pollan. Então, para abrir o nosso apetite para a hora do almoço, que vai ser agora. Tivemos um problema com a nossa mediadora, Lúcia Guimarães, que é uma das maiores jornalistas do nosso país, que eu estava muito orgulhoso de ter ao lado do Pollan. Mas ela chegou a Paraty nessa madrugada e com problemas de saúde e não vai poder estar conosco. Então, eu lamento e vou substituí-la como puder, né? A Lúcia me enviou algumas perguntas, me preparou um pouco para o que ela estava pensando, e eu acho que vai ser uma grande conversa com o Pollan. Gostaria, então, de convidar o Michael Pollan, por favor, para entrar no palco.
Thank you.
Bom, muito obrigado, Michael, pela presença, é uma grande honra. Estamos com aqui um dos maiores escritores de não ficção dos nossos tempos, né? O Pollan veio ao Brasil lançar este livro que está saindo agora, Cozinhar, que é um acontecimento, e que vem de uma série de outros livros, a qual ele vem se dedicando desde que ele deixou o seu trabalho cotidiano de jornalista na redação. Ele passou mais de 10 anos como editor da revista Harper's, ele continua no jornalismo, colaborador da revista New Yorker. A gente até pode ler, de vez em quando, essas reportagens na imprensa brasileira. A última foi publicada na revista Piauí, sobre as ervas. É um estudo muito original e interessante, como toda a obra do Pollan. O trabalho dele, que hoje é realmente um best-seller nos Estados Unidos, o Dilema do Onívoro, que é o livro anterior dele, chegou a vender 1,5 milhão de exemplares nos Estados Unidos. As Regras da Comida é um outro livro muito importante que ele lançou, um livro muito sintético, que lembra, inclusive, o nosso autor homenageado, porque o Pollan faz aforismos, né? São frases curtas e espirituosas sobre o que comer, como comer, né? Esse título autoexplicativo, As Regras da Comida. No entanto, essa questão da comida não é uma questão isolada no trabalho dele, né? Ele não inventou esse assunto. Ele vem de uma série de outros livros que constituem uma obra muito coerente e muito substanciosa, na qual ele transforma a escrita, né, o ensaio, e por isso que ele vem sendo reconhecido como um dos maiores ensaístas americanos hoje. Teve ensaios incluídos em coletâneas dos melhores ensaístas americanos. Ele faz o ensaio, a escrita, como uma espécie de um laboratório experimental, né? E o ensaio, a gente sabe, ontem quem esteve aqui na mesa com o Mathieu Landon e o Silviano Santiago, como bem lembrou o Paulo Roberto Pires, que estava mediando, o ensaio é aquele gênero que mescla uma experiência pessoal com uma reflexão. Então é isso que o Michael vem fazendo desde os seus primeiros livros, né? Por exemplo, em Botany of Desire, que é um livro, acho que o mais antigo, seu primeiro livro, Michael?
Third.
É o terceiro. Esse livro ele transforma o próprio jardim da casa dele, né, que ele estava cultivando, ele aprendeu botânica, numa experiência literária. Ele aprendeu a cultivar, aprendeu, enfim, todos os segredos de um jardineiro, toda a beleza, toda a ciência, né, e transforma esse espaço tão prosaico, tão comum, que parece tão conhecido, que é o jardim da própria casa, num campo de estudos, né? E campo em que várias coisas se entrecruzam, né? Da mesma forma, ele fez com a arquitetura. Quando ele foi construir a casa de campo dele em Connecticut, ele, em vez de contratar apenas um arquiteto ou fazer ali um rabisco do que ele queria, ele foi estudar arquitetura. Ele chegou em Vitrúvios, não é? Para estudar o que é construir a sua casa. O que você quer construindo a sua casa? Quais são os materiais? Qual a concepção histórica de casa? Qual a evolução desse conceito? E como a experiência pessoal dele ia se completar nesse quadro todo. A cozinha, então, pareceu, talvez, o território mais seguro que o Poulan encontrou para explorar esse múltiplo cruzamento cultural que ele encontra nos seus livros. Então, você tem a cozinha da casa dele, imagino que seja uma cozinha como a de qualquer outro, talvez mais equipada, não sei, mas uma cozinha. Ele descobriu que essa cozinha ela é um sítio arqueológico. Você pode pesquisar a história da humanidade na sua própria cozinha. Há um conhecimento histórico, há uma tradição, há uma série de elementos históricos e sociais que se condensam naquela cozinha. Sobreposto a isso, você tem a cozinha como uma espécie de um laboratório científico, né? E não nesse sentido que a gente está acostumado a ver na vida da gastronomia, alta gastronomia, que é cozinha molecular, ou então experiências com equipamentos novos. Não, ele está indo aos princípios do cozimento, né? Aos princípios da alimentação, ao reconhecimento dos ingredientes e a reflexão sobre o que a gente está comendo, né? Então, isso faz desse laboratório científico, que é a cozinha do Poulan, ele também um laboratório experimental e um laboratório de um alquimista, né? Tanto que a alquimia é o campo que empresta para o Michael o modelo para ele escrever esse novo livro dele, que é Cozinhar. Então, ele é organizado segundo os 4 elementos, né? Ele quer mostrar que a transformação alquímica, né? No fundo, é disso que a gente está falando, da transformação da natureza, né? E a cozinha talvez seja esse campo em que a natureza e a cultura estão mais conversando mais intensamente, né? Você está falando de natureza, está falando de reações químicas, está falando de botânica, de vegetais, de animais, de fisiologia humana, mas você está falando da cultura, está falando de como a ética da alimentação, a estética da alimentação, enfim, é um campo em que se cruzam ciência, história, sociologia, antropologia, ensaio, literatura. É uma coisa interessante, quem tiver o exemplar do livro, olhar no índice remissivo do livro, em que rabanetes estão misturados a Sigmund Freud, não é? Em qual outro livro você encontraria essa, com perdão da expressão, salada de referências que faz do Poulan um grande escritor, um escritor original, e que tem uma atuação política da maior importância. A gente sabe que esses livros, o Dilema do Onívoro, As Regras da Comida, Em Defesa da Comida, eles são livros de um ensaísta, são livros de um escritor, mas eles são panfletos, são manifestos verdadeiros para que alguma coisa seja feita diante dessa tragédia que a gente está vivendo, que é a obesidade, a comida industrial e todos os males que vêm com elas, né? Que são desde os males mesmo para o nosso próprio corpo, e os Estados Unidos são um país que vive uma epidemia de obesidade que nós estamos copiando, né? Nós estamos bravamente indo atrás do exemplo.
You're catching up.
Yes.
Yeah.
E, então, é uma tragédia nacional, é um problema de saúde pública, e nem preciso explicar muito. Mas também há aqui um cruzamento cultural, um cruzamento científico, porque, ao falar da cozinha industrial, nós estamos falando do meio ambiente, nós estamos falando das fazendas onde os nossos alimentos são produzidos, de como os animais que nós comemos são tratados, de como no que vai dar essa agricultura extensiva, irracional, que está derrubando florestas para fazer, enfim, produzir algo que conforme o Michael Pollan mostra, vai contra tudo aquilo que, depois de pensar, você imagina que você quer. Sim, me perdoem, eu estou aqui numa situação... Eu quero até pedir desculpas, porque eu estou aqui substituindo a mediadora, não quero fazer um mau trabalho. Obrigado. Bom, obrigado. Muito bem. Mas não deixa de ter razão, né? Vamos deixar o Polan falar. Eu queria apenas apresentar, porque a gente tende a ver, às vezes, isso é gastronomia, isso é agricultura, isso é ciência. Não, está tudo misturado, como aqui em Paraty, a gente está vivendo a vida todo junto e misturado, que é como ela deve ser vivida, né? Michael, por favor, como é que foi... você pode nos apresentar o seu livro, falar como foi escrever esse livro, o que você pretendia e onde você chegou?
I would be happy to. Thank you, Paolo, for that extravagant summary of my work. But I appreciate it. I mean, you're right. My subject is everyday life, and the wonder of it, and the fact that we engage nature more in our kitchens and our gardens and our everyday lives than we do when we go on vacation and when we hike, and so that is really fundamentally where I come from. And thank you all for coming. It's such a privilege to be at this literary festival, which in the course of 10 or 11 years has established itself as one of the world's greatest literary festivals, and certainly the most beautiful. And so I'm very happy to be here. I'm sorry Lucia couldn't be here, but thank you very much for filling in so ably. Cooked is not a book I ever planned to write. It wasn't part of my life strategy. But I have been on a journey now for almost 15 years of following the food chain, looking at food from the very beginning in the soil and following it through the system into our bodies and what it does to our health. And so in Omnivore's Dilemma, I tried to answer a very simple question, which is, where does our food come from? And, you know, this is something everybody once knew. A lot of the work I do would be irrelevant 75 years ago because everyone knew where food came from. And we have lost that thread. We no longer know where, when we eat a McDonald's meal or when we eat any number of things, where did it come from? How was it made? What's in it? And so I wrote this series of detective stories following food back to the farm. And I learned something very interesting there that planted the seed of Cooked, and that was that we were remaking the landscape of the world in the image of a factory, a giant factory of plants and animals, unprecedented in humankind, farms thousands of hectares in extent, feedlots with animals crammed together, standing their whole lives in their own manure. And this new landscape, which very few of us have seen because it is hidden from us. You don't see pictures of cattle feedlots when you buy a hamburger or you stand in the restaurant looking at the menu. They usually will show, you know, cowboys and grass and beautiful images that are no longer actually accurate. But it occurred to me that this landscape we are complicit in the creation of this landscape. Our eating choices allowed this landscape to develop. And the important choice that did that was when we began outsourcing our cooking to large corporations. For most of human history, cooking was done by human beings that you knew, if not yourself. Beginning in the United States in the 50s and 60s and increasing through the 70s and 80s, we gave that work over to these big corporations. And they do it very differently than humans do. And for one thing, they don't buy from small farms. They want every chicken to look identical. They want every potato to be the exact same russet Burbank long potato. And that quest for uniformity and cheap ingredients is what has driven this new landscape. And we can talk more about the problems with that landscape, but besides its visual monotony, it's highly dependent on chemicals. And it is very destructive of soils, and now increasingly it requires genetically modified crops. So I realized then that the decline of cooking in our lives was responsible for remaking agriculture. And that idea I kind of put away in the back of my head. And after Omnivore's Dilemma, I went to the other end of the food chain. I'd been on the soil end, I went to the body end. What happens to our bodies when we take this new food into it? How does it change us? Because when we eat, we take nature in, and it changes us in good ways and in bad ways. And I made a study of nutrition science in the book called In Defense of Food. And it's a fascinating subject. I was trying to understand, what should you eat? If you're concerned about your diet, what should you eat? It's so confusing. Sometimes we're told to worry about fat, and sometimes we're told to worry about sugar, and now we're told to worry about gluten. I even see the water in Brazil says contains no gluten. Congratulations. I've never seen water with gluten.
Obrigado.
But now we're sure. So the labels are confusing. And the supermarket has become quite a treacherous landscape to navigate. But the thing I learned when I studied nutrition was that the key to eating well was not the nutrients, good or bad. And that's what we obsess about: vitamins, antioxidants, carbohydrates, fat. The key thing was it real food, and was it prepared by human beings? In other words, minimally processed. And that the best evidence, the best indicator of a healthy diet was not how many calories it has or how much fat and salt and sugar, but simply this: was it cooked by a human being, or was it cooked by an industrial corporation? So between those two things, I realized that cooking as a subject, which takes place between the farm and the body, it's where we take the things of nature, transform them into meals, was a link in the food chain I needed to examine and explore. And so I began this quest, as I always do. As you suggested in my writing, I make my home a laboratory. And I go out from there, but I like to put myself in my stories and learn so that the reader can learn along with me. So I set about learning how to cook. And by cook, I don't just mean make dinner or lunch or breakfast. I mean learn how to bake bread, learn how to ferment beer, learn how to make cheese, all these transformations. And that's the journey I've been on. It's been a journey of incredible pleasure. Some of my work has taken you to very dark places, like Omnivore's Dilemma, parts of it. Ugly landscapes, frightening landscapes. This one is, for the most part, a very hopeful book. And the reason I did it this way was because I didn't want to simply make a lecture, an argument for the importance of cooking, even though I think cooking is one of the most important human activities we perform. And that's not an exaggeration. It is the key to connecting with nature, and it is the key to connecting with one another, and it is the key to our health. So that was the project, and it was a long journey, and we can talk about it in more detail. But I thought I would start by just reading you two or three paragraphs so you get a flavor of the kinds of questions I was seeking to answer. And this is from the very beginning of Cooked. Why cook? At a certain point in the late middle of my life, I made the unexpected but happy discovery that the answer to several of the questions that most occupied me was, in fact, one and the same: cook. Some of these questions were personal. For example, what was the single most important thing we could do as a family to improve our health and general well-being? And what would be a better way to connect to my teenage son? As it turned out, this involved not only ordinary cooking, but also the specialized form of it known as brewing. Other questions were slightly more political in nature. For years, I had been trying to determine, because I am often asked, what is the most important thing an ordinary person can do to help reform the food system, to make it healthier and more sustainable? Another related question is, how can people living in a highly specialized consumer economy reduce their sense of dependence and achieve a greater degree of self-sufficiency? And then there were the more philosophical questions, the ones I've been chewing on since I first started writing. How in our everyday lives can we acquire a deeper understanding of the natural world and our species' peculiar role in it? You can always go to the woods to confront such questions, but I discovered that even more interesting answers could be had simply by going to the kitchen. Thank you.
E o livro faz essa exploração do território da cozinha, né? Mas também não só, você vai além, você chegou a trabalhar como fazendeiro, para um fazendeiro da Virgínia, né? Você trabalhou no cultivo dos alimentos. Como foi essa experiência de trabalhar sob a orientação desse produtor familiar?
Yeah, you're referring to a brilliant visionary farmer named Joel Salatin, who I wrote about in Omnivore's Dilemma. And again, I very much like to get my hands dirty when I'm doing work, doing my journalism. I like to write from the perspective of someone who has direct involvement, because I think very often the journalist perspective is very easy. It's very easy to be cynical if you're a journalist, because you're on the sidelines and you don't have any skin in the game, as we say. So I went to work on this farm, and it's in Virginia, and in the Shenandoah Valley, and it's a very unusual farm in that he's growing 6 different animal species together in a very intricate dance that he choreographs. And he's got grass-fed cattle, and he's got pork, and he's got chickens, both roasters and laying hens, and sometimes he has sheep and he has rabbits. And every animal is in a symbiotic relationship with every other animal. So that, to give you one example of these relationships, the cattle spend a day in a paddock that he creates with this very inexpensive electronic fencing. So I could put a paddock, a quarter-acre, eighth of a hectare paddock together in 10 minutes and carry the fencing on my back. And you plug it into a car battery, and they spend one day there, and then the cattle move to the next paddock. Every night they move, and they've mowed down the grass, and then he waits 3 days, and then he moves a portable chicken coop into the same paddock. And the reason he does that is because the chickens then spill out of their portable home. They have like a mobile home, and hundreds of them, and they spread out over the grass, and they go right for the cow patties, the manure of the cows. And the reason is that their favorite food in the world are the grubs or the larvae of the flies that are always with cows. And they pick through the manure and they spread it out. Joel calls them his sanitation crew, and they eat all the grubs, so he doesn't have a fly problem. He controls his flies without pesticides, okay? And then they fertilize the grass with their own manure, which has a lot of nitrogen in it, and then he moves them to the next paddock. And every day the animals are moving, and it's quite an amazing, it's a mobile farm. There are very few fixed structures on this farm. But what was most meaningful to me about being on his farm and actually changed my understanding of the human relationship to nature, not just food, was he explained to me when I got there, I love animals and I wanted to meet the pigs. I used to have a pet pig when I was a kid named Kosher. I said, "Can we go see the pigs now?" And the cows, he said, no, first you must meet the star of my farm, and that is the grass. The grass is the basis of this whole food chain. And so we got down on our bellies, and he introduced me to all the grass species and the worm castings and everything, and he explained what happens. And what happens is when a cow or a steer eats grass, the plant starts off about 2 or 3 feet high, and they cut it down to about 1 inch or 2, and something interesting happens underground, which is that the plant kills off the same amount of root mass as it lost in leaf mass, because plants are always trying to balance their leaves and their roots. And those dead roots then decompose and are broken down by the bacteria and the microbes and fungi and worms, and that's how soil is created. Soil is made from the relationship of cattle, grass, and roots. And it grows from the bottom up. And so at the end of the year, not only has this farmer taken all this beautiful food off the farm, large amounts, this is a very productive farm, large amounts of grass-fed beef and eggs and chickens and pork and rabbits, but at the end of the year, there is more soil, not less. There is more biodiversity, not less. There is more fertility, not less. And you see, this is a radical idea because most of us have in our heads an idea that our relationship to nature is zero-sum, so that we get what we want, whether it's food or energy or entertainment, and nature is diminished. It's something for us, less for nature, a process of subtraction. And what a truly sustainable farm demonstrates, proves, is that this is not necessarily the case. That there are ways to organize our farms, and probably our lives, where nature is improved rather than diminished. And there is an expression in English called the free lunch. And it turns out there is a free lunch if we only knew how to cook it.
E essa experiência com a terra é um dos pilares do livro, né? Como eu disse, você organiza o seu livro a partir dos 4 elementos: água, terra, fogo e ar, né? No capítulo da terra, você ainda fala muito dos micro-organismos, né? Que a gente já conhece a partir do queijo, da cerveja, mas você mostra como as excessivas, os processos industriais estão retirando a nossa exposição a bactérias necessárias, aquelas que a gente deveria estar tendo contato e estamos nos separando. Quais são essas bactérias? Que são os tutores, né? Como você chama, né?
Yeah, for me, one of the fascinating things I learned about in doing this book, in the last section, I learned about the importance of microbes. You know, like many people, I grew up fearing bacteria because bacteria cause disease, and it does. I mean, 1% of bacteria make us sick. But it turns out that we are highly dependent, as that soil on that farm is, on bacteria to help us make our food and to keep us healthy. And I learned something astonishing, which is that 90% of the cells in your body don't belong to you. They belong to bacteria that lives on you and in you. And that those bacteria are not just freeloaders. They're not just there getting a free ride. They're performing essential functions for you. They're helping you digest your food. They're tuning or educating your immune system, teaching it how to recognize friend and foe so you don't have allergies and things like gluten intolerance. They are creating vitamins. They actually take, the bacteria in your large intestine actually take the food you eat, if you're eating the right kind of food, and create essential fatty acids, vitamins, vitamin B, for example. So they're critically important to us, and we didn't know this. And so we haven't been taking very good care of them. As you suggest, industrial food, that classic, you know, McDonald's meal with the soda and the French fries feeds your body, but leaves very little for the bacteria, who their favorite food is fiber, plants, and you don't get that with fast food. And so if you're not feeding your gut bacteria, you are much more likely to suffer from allergies. You're much more likely to be inflamed. You're much more likely to be obese and have type 2 diabetes. And I think we will learn in the next few years that of all the problems with the Western diet that we've been worrying about, you know, we've worried about the sugar, we've worried about the fat. What we probably should have been worrying about most was the fact that it was starving our gut bacteria. And that because that's what processed food does. It's very interesting. One of the ways we learned this was in our study of mother's milk. You know, mother's milk is nature's perfect food. It's the only food that has been designed by natural selection. It's everything a baby needs to live. So it's worth studying if you want to understand what humans need to live. And for many years, we've been trying to simulate it with infant formula. And we've never gotten it right. At first, we thought you needed protein, carbohydrates, fats, and the babies would be fine, but you gave them that, and they died. And then we figured out, oh, you need vitamins too, so we'll put some vitamins in. And they still didn't do very well. And then we realized, you need different kinds of fats. You need omega-3 fatty acids, so we put that in, and they did better. But there was a mystery about this milk that was only recently unpacked, and that is that about 40% of mother's milk consists of a sugar, it's called an oligosaccharide, that the baby cannot digest. The baby lacks the enzymes you need to digest this sugar. So what is it doing there? 40%. Well, they recently figured out it's there to feed the gut bacteria and encourage the right kind. So nature designed its perfect food with the bacteria in mind, not just the baby. And I think we're going to need to design our food in the same way. So we're no longer starving those very important parts of your body. 90%.
E, bom, infelizmente não podemos nos alimentar mais de leite materno para sempre, né? Então, você no
No,
seu
but we can eat plants.
no seu dia a dia, como é você cozinhando ali na sua casa, uma refeição normal? O que tem na sua geladeira que a gente não pode saber? E o que costuma ter, né?
Well, my wife is here, so she can tell me if I've missed anything. But, our eating is very normal, and I don't think anybody would be particularly surprised. We actually eat very simply, because like most people, we're very busy. We don't have hours every day to spend cooking. On the weekends, we might make something special that takes a couple hours, but during the week, we mostly cook things that you can cook in a half hour. We grill a lot because we live in California. We like vegetables, and we have many meals without meat. And my wife is a master cook of vegetables. And we eat leftovers, which I think, needs a better label, at least in English. But we try to be strategic in our cooking so that if, let's say, we're making salmon for dinner and we're grilling salmon or roasting salmon, I'll make twice as much as we need. And so that meal will roll into the next. And we'll make a salad with that salmon or make tacos with that salmon the next day. And I think to the extent you can have one meal feed the next meal, it helps deal with the time crunch that most people feel. So we cook about 4 or 5 nights a week, go out maybe once or twice. And that's the way we eat. It's not rocket science. It's the way people have been eating for a very long time.
E uma coisa que salta aos olhos na leitura dos seus livros é como uma associação ao prazer, né? Porque quando se fala de comida saudável, a gente sempre pensa em restrições e angústia, quanto mais a gente se informa sobre o que tem no nosso prato, a gente às vezes fica mais desanimado a continuar comendo a mesma coisa. Como você lida com essa angústia e com as restrições? Depois de aprender tudo isso, você acha que você se abriu mais ainda para diferentes experiências? Ou você tem restringido cada vez mais o seu consumo por uma hiperconsciência daquilo que está vindo parar no seu prato?
Yeah. What I've learned about food has actually in some ways made me more relaxed about eating, especially what I've learned about nutrition, because it really does seem to be the case that if you restrict yourself to real food, and there's a lot of real food still out there, and all my eating advice comes down to 7 words. I put them right at the beginning of my In Defense of Food. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. That's all you need to know. That's not very hard to do. Now, eat food sounds hard because, well, isn't it all food? I don't think it's all food. I think the supermarket is full of stuff that hasn't earned that honor to be called food. And so I call it, instead of food, edible food-like substances. And we need to avoid eating edible food-like substances, which is processed food, basically. And I have various tests, so you know which is which. But I think cultivating a relaxed attitude toward food is part of health also. If you're anxious about food all the time, that can't be good for you either. And so if you focus more on, is this real food I'm eating? And the not too much part is hard for people. I think that that's a cultural issue that we have to work on because we have been selling food on the basis of quantity rather than quality for a long time in America. And I think it's true here from what I've observed. And that we need to move the focus back more toward quality. And that what you're looking for in a meal is not just lots of calories. You're looking for lots of food experience, that intensity of flavor, that pleasure. And you can have that without eating too much food. But we kind of socialize our children. You know, we say, at least in the United States, I don't know, I'd be curious to know what's true here in Brazil. When our kids are at the table, we say, "Are you full?" That's the wrong question to ask. Because you're teaching them that they should eat until they're full. And if you look at in French, they don't ask that question. They say when you're hungry, they say "j'ai faim," I have hunger. And when you're done, "je n'ai plus faim," I no longer have hunger. That's a completely different idea. Because the moment at which you no longer have hunger is several bites before you're like stuffed. So the quantity issue is a big one. But I don't see, I was asked this question by a journalist earlier today, that there's a trade-off between healthy eating and pleasure. There are different kinds of pleasure, and there is the pleasure of fast food that many people, especially kids, feel. But if you really pay attention to that food, really like listen to your taste buds, you will find that that food is superficially attractive. It's the difference between pornography and real sex. It's, you know, it's a synthetic pleasure. And when you cultivate your sense of taste, you won't enjoy that food. The one rule I really have is I don't eat meat grown on feedlots in factory farms. And I do this because I've been on these farms, and they're horrible places. And the stink in your nostrils lasts for weeks, and on your clothing when you go there. And so I'm very careful about the meat I eat, and with the result that I don't eat meat as often, because truly sustainable meat is expensive and hard to find. Less so now, but it still is hard to find. So that's the main restriction, but I don't find it very hard to live with.
Bom, essa frase que ele mencionou agora, coma comida, principalmente plantas, e pouco, não é? Eu esqueci a formulação exata em português.
Not too much.
Né? Não muito, né? É o que todos tentamos, eu tento pelo menos ensinar a minha filha, e ela não obedece nenhuma das regras. Ela não come tinta, adora besteira, comida industrializada e aos montes, né? Uma pergunta que chega da plateia aqui, da Camila Estima, ela fala: a comida industrializada tem a característica de ser altamente palatável e é uma grande barreira para diminuir o seu consumo em crianças. O que você sugere como estratégia quando reclamam de vegetais que não têm sabor tão interessante e palatável?
Well, you know, I think we face a real challenge with our children because we are not the only voices they're hearing. They're hearing the voices of very sophisticated food marketers. In the United States, fast food is sold to children with toys. So they have come to associate the Happy Meal that McDonald's sells. So they have come to associate eating this food with getting a toy. I don't think that should be allowed. I don't think we should be marketing food to children. Children, by definition, are not in a position to make important decisions about their welfare. That's our definition of children. You can't exercise personal responsibility until you reach a certain age and understand the decisions you're making. Otherwise, you're being manipulated. And these companies should not come between parents and their kids, because that's what they're doing. They're interfering in that critical relationship where you get to teach your kids what food is and what food is not. We did not restrict our son, and he did like to eat at McDonald's sometimes. And this was kind of before I knew very much about McDonald's. But over time, I think we helped sensitize him to the fact that a chicken nugget really isn't very good. It tastes like salt and some synthetic idea of chicken. And that if you talk to your kids about this, you can not argue with them. I don't think you can argue kids into one kind of food or another. And there's a lot of research suggesting telling kids vegetables are good for you is the wrong way to get them to eat vegetables. You just put them out there and make it normal and enjoy it yourself. The other thing you do with kids, I think, is get them into the kitchen. When children cook, which they can do at a pretty young age, I mean, maybe not handle knives, but do everything else, they will eat what they cook. And to children, food is something they don't trust because it's being pushed on them, they don't know what's in it, it's mysterious. But if they cook, they understand it. They see, okay, this is, if you put this plus this minus that, that's dinner. And so I found with our son that the more we got him involved in cooking, the better he ate. And going back even further, when you take a child into the garden and let them harvest vegetables, peas, broccoli, beans, carrots, they will eat them when they see them growing, and they pick them themselves. So give them an investment. And basically, you know, if you don't keep crap around the house, they will not eat crap. I mean, so getting soda out of the house, I think, is critical. I think soda is a tremendous public health problem. And if you don't have it in your house, they will only eat it when they go out to other people's, and it'll be very special. But that's fine. I mean, there's nothing evil about soda every now and then. It's the everyday consumption of those foods that I think is what gets us into trouble. So we shouldn't fetishize it as, you know, this horrible evil you never touch, but you have to put it back in its place as special occasion food.
E uma coisa muito interessante que existe nessa abordagem do Pollan aí, em relação à educação, porque não se trata só de aprender a comer, né, aprender a se nutrir, etc. Mas ele politiza a questão da alimentação desde a própria cozinha, né? No livro aqui que está saindo pela Intrínseca, ele fala sobre a mesa de refeição em família como ele chama de o berçário da democracia, né? Então não é só onde você aprende a comer, mas é onde você aprende a conversar, você aprende a responder, a respeitar o outro, a esperar a sua vez. Essa politização da comida, do horário da refeição, é uma coisa que vem da sua própria formação. Você em casa teve aí uma super mesa de família para aprender essa história? Como foi?
Well, I was very lucky. I grew up in a house. I have 3 sisters, and my mother liked to cook, and she cooked every night. And every day at 6 o'clock we had a meal. And Fridays and Saturdays they took off and they went out, and we would eat TV dinners and stuff like that, which we loved. But we always sat down together. And the family meal is a very complicated space socially, right? I mean, it's not always peace and love and understanding. Sometimes there's a lot of bickering and fighting, and somebody doesn't like this, and someone doesn't want to be at the table, and someone's kicking the other person under the table. I mean, you know, it's a messy experience, but it's really important because it is, as you suggest, the nursery of democracy. You learn the tools of citizenship. I know this sounds like a very large claim, but you learn the tools of citizenship at the family table, which is to say, you learn how to share, as you said. You learn how to take turns. You learn how to fight or argue without fighting. And you learn how to listen. And you learn the news of the day. I learned about the war in Vietnam from my parents talking about it at the table. And so if you think about it, where else does that happen in your house? Because aside from that table, everybody's off doing their own thing. You know, they're doing homework, they're on screens. This is a time where you can come together. It becomes a center of gravity. And the loss of that center, I think, is leading to the coarsening of our civilization. And when we eat industrially, we don't share. You know, the food companies, that beautiful black moqueca pot that, you know, you eat that delicious dish from, means a lot. And the food industry wants to take that away. They would much rather that your son ate pizza and you ate a salad and your daughter ate chicken and you each had an individual thing, like a restaurant, because they sell more food if they can divide us into demographic niches. The shared pot is a key institution. It puts us all on the same page emotionally. I'm convinced, there's no research for this, but that when we eat the same things, similar chemical changes are happening. Food is a drug, too, and it puts people in a very similar space. And so sharing food, which is endangered, traditional foods, which are under threat, need to be defended. And that's why I say in the book that cooking is a political act. It's a very important political act. It's one of the few ways we have to take back control of our diet and to take back control of our agriculture, too. Because when you cook, you buy ingredients. And when you buy ingredients, you get to vote for what kind of agriculture you want to support. Do you want to support organic? Do you want to support local? Do you want to support industrial? You can decide. And you lose control of all those decisions when you let corporations do your cooking.
Isso tem a ver com uma pergunta que chegou do público. Aqui tem uma tonelada de perguntas, eu vou fazer todas as que eu puder. O Peter May está perguntando aqui se você conhece... não, perdão, é o José Ferreira. Se você conhece e tem opinião sobre as experiências no Brasil de agroecologia e agrofloresta tropical. A exemplo do pequeno produtor rural no Brasil. Você visitou, me parece, no Rio de Janeiro, uma fazenda de orgânicos, não foi?
No. I have not visited any farms in Brazil yet. I really wish I had had a chance. I've read a lot about agroecology in Brazil. You know, one of the things people don't realize is that a highly diversified farm of the kind I was describing earlier, where there are 10, 20, 30 different crops, animals and plants together, produces more food per hectare than a giant farm of soya or maize, of corn. We get this, we hear that only industrial agriculture can feed the world because it's so productive, but it's not really producing food. It's producing animal feed. 30% of what we're growing is going to feed animals, which is a very inefficient way to feed the world. It produces ethanol, which we're putting in our cars, which is not feeding anybody except our cars. And that these diversified farms are highly productive. So why aren't there more of them? Well, they take a lot of labor, and I think that's the key. The challenge to feeding the world is going to be how many farmers do we have, not how much land we have. How many farmers do we have? Because the more complicated the farming, the more diversified the farming, the more eyes you need on the land. And that's what worries me. If we empty out our rural areas and everybody moves to the city and we have one big farm out there trying to grow our food, it's not going to work. Mm-hmm. It's just not going to work. So it's very important, I think, in the developing world for governments to support agroecology and have programs that keep people on the land, where they can produce for themselves and for the cities, and produce real food and not these commodities. Because we shouldn't, when we look at that field of soya, that is not food. That is food for pigs in China. That's what the best land in Brazil is being used for now. The Chinese like to eat pork, and they don't want to waste their land on soya, so they're very happy that you oblige with yours. And so I think that these issues of food security, but also food sovereignty, who makes the decisions about how a country's land gets used, who controls the land, are going to be the geopolitical issues in the future. Because as the population grows, there'll be more competition for resources. And so I lost track of the question, but I hope that answered it.
Bom, mas isso é realmente uma questão que o Brasil está vivendo agora, porque a gente está num momento de expansão agrícola e há uma ideologia vigente de que o Brasil é o celeiro do mundo e que nós teremos os fornecedores de comida para um mundo sem comida. existe também uma ideia de que os orgânicos e todas essas iniciativas mais sustentáveis seriam insustentáveis num plano demográfico de 7 bilhões de pessoas, né? Então, que seria, há quem diga, inclusive, que os orgânicos são uma forma de distinção social, né? Você, eu como orgânico, então sou melhor do que você. Você considera, como você enfrenta esse tipo de crítica e como você vê a experiência do Brasil, você vindo dos Estados Unidos, que é um grande país agrícola, que já passou por algumas desses processos de agricultura extensiva que a gente está vendo no Brasil, com transgênicos, com organismos modificados. Como é que foi a experiência americana nesse sentido?
Well, the Feed the World argument is a very important question, and it has to be addressed with, first, a frank acknowledgement that we don't know how to feed 9 or 10 billion people. We have some ideas, but the assertion that industrial agriculture is necessary to feed the world is unproven, and I think can be disproved. I mean, consider that now, where we have industrial agriculture over a large portion of the United States, over a large portion of South America, highly productive commodity agriculture, with GM usually, is failing to feed the world that we have now, the world of 6 billion people or 7 billion people. Even though we are growing nearly 3,000 calories per person per day. You only need 2,000 calories. So we're growing all this food, but we have 1 billion people hungry in the world today, and we have 1 billion people overfed. We are stuffed and starved at the same time. So it tells you that quantity is not the only issue here. It has to do with, do you have money to buy that food? It's an issue of equity. The people in Qatar or Bahrain have eat more food than anybody on the planet right now. The Emirates, and they grow nothing, but they have the money to command the food. So this issue that if you merely grow plenty of food and you treat agriculture as a sacrifice zone to generate all these calories, everybody will be well fed. There is no evidence that that will be the case, and it's not the case now. So you have to look at what are you using that food for. 30% to feed animals. Very inefficient way to feed the world, because it takes 10 pounds of grain to grow 1 pound of beef. So much better to have people eat grain. You could feed a lot more people. Another 20% of what we're growing is going to ethanol. That could be food. And then we have 40% of all the food we're growing in the world today is wasted, simply wasted, on the farm, through processing, and in the back of your refrigerator. So there is a lot of slack in this system that if you allocated the land and the crops differently, you could feed a lot more people. Now, whether sustainable agriculture could be that productive is a real question. Right now, organic yields are lower than conventional yields. Not by a lot, by about 10 to 20%. However, those farms are much more resilient to the kinds of challenges we're going to face. See, the genius of industrial agriculture is that it, with the perfect hybrid seed, it can produce large amounts. But everything has to go right. You have to control for water. You have to control for fertilizer. You have to control for pests. Because these super plants they're like princes. You know, they're very delicate, and they need to be pampered. But as soon as you have climate change, all bets are off, because you can't count on the weather. You can't count on the amount of water. You need an agriculture that is more resilient, even if it is somewhat less productive. And what you find with organic agriculture, which takes care of the soil and focuses on the soil, if you have a healthy organic soil, the plants actually produce more in drought years than industrial agriculture. More. And they do fine in very wet years. So what you have with a good soil is a resilience. that you don't have with industrial agriculture, which is very brittle. So I feel as we head into this era of gross uncertainty in agriculture, organic is going to look better and better and better.
Bom, você falou dos micro-organismos, né, alguns deles ligados à terra, né, alguns outros desses micro-organismos são ligados ao ar, né, os fermentos, né, que fazem o pão, a cerveja. Eu queria que você falasse como esses 4 elementos aparecem no livro Cozinhar, que acabou de sair, contando a histórias saborosas, personagens que você encontrou ao fazer a pesquisa.
Yeah, okay. Well, as I said, I had a great time writing this book, and it's organized by the 4 classical elements. And I begin with fire, which is the oldest kind of cooking. It's 2 million years old. We've been cooking with fire. It is the discovery that set us apart. It changed us as a species. When we mastered fire, that's the moment when our brains got much bigger than the other apes, and our guts shrank. Now we're going in the other direction. But and the reason was that cooked food is more nutritious than raw food. And that when you cook food, it's partially digested outside of the body. It's broken down. So your body doesn't have to use as much energy to break it down. And you don't have to spend as much time chewing. I learned in my research that apes our size spend half their waking hours in the act of chewing. It's very hard to get much done if you're spending 6 or 8 hours a day chewing. But cooking relieved us and opened up all this time for wonderful things like literary festivals and such. For that section, I spent time with barbecue pitmasters, kind of people who do this whole hog barbecue. They take a whole pig, they cook it very slowly over a coals, not even a fire, 24 hours, 20 hours to cook. And I went down to North Carolina for that. And I met Ed Mitchell, who's this wonderful character. He's a big black Santa Claus with a white beard, and he was very generous in sharing his secrets. And the secret of great barbecue turns out to be time. Slow and slow. Cook your meat. And I've applied that. I mean, most of us cook food too fast because we're in a rush. But when you slow down, you get wonderful results. And then water, I learned really everyday home cooking. That's braising. Cooking in pots doesn't happen until only 10,000 years ago because we didn't have pots you could put over a fire. And that's a huge development for our species because, you know, when you cook meat over a flame, you lose a lot of nutrients. They drip into the fire. But if you cook in a pot, you save everything, and you get this wonderful dividend called sauce. And it allows you to soften grain and make porridges, which allows you to have agriculture. So without the cook pot, you would not have agriculture, because agriculture is essentially growing lots of hard seeds that need to be ground and wetted. And it also allowed you to extend the human lifespan, because now you had soft foods, soups and porridges, that you could feed to babies so you could wean them earlier, and you could feed to old people and keep them alive. Because before that, when you lost your teeth, you were kind of screwed. And but now you could keep people alive longer. In baking, I'll jump ahead and talk about one character who I particularly liked. Baking, I talk about bread, and I learned how to bake bread, and that's an amazing process because it involves not only heat and water, but microbes to ferment the bread. And I learned from a food scientist, actually, that if I gave you a big bag of flour, even whole grain flour, and water, you could live for a few weeks, but that's about it on that. But if you took that flour and water and turned it into bread, you could live indefinitely. And it is the action of those microbes and the heat that makes that substandard food, flour, into something that can support human life. And the reason is that the microbes, basically, flour is a seed. It's a crushed grass seed. And it's designed to feed the next generation of the plant, not us. And so the nutrients are all locked up tight in these long-chain molecules. And the microbes get to work on it, and they start breaking down those chains. So the proteins and the fats and the carbohydrates become available to us. So fermented grain is much healthier, which, you know, if you're making porridge, you should try to ferment it if you can, a little bit. And then when you bake it, you can get the grain hotter than you could in a porridge, because you can't boil anything more than the boiling point. But the loaf of bread becomes a pressure cooker, and all those little bubbles of air steam, and steam can get much hotter than the boiling point, and that cooks the starch at such a high temperature, 400 or 500 degrees, I don't know what it is in Celsius, and that makes the carbohydrates very digestible. So anyway, but the character I want to tell you about is a nun named Sister Noella, who makes cheese in Connecticut. She makes a French cheese called the Saint-Nectaire. And I went to learn how to make cheese with her. And she's, in addition to being a nun, she's a microbiologist. And she knows everything about the little microbes that make cheese. When you eat cheese, you know, on that rind, it's a giant wilderness of fungus and bacteria you're eating, but good ones. She was making cheese in a very traditional way with a wooden barrel and a wooden paddle. Now, any public health person would say, you can't do that. It must be stainless steel, you know, which we think of as the sanitary material. She was convinced, though, that the wood was important to the recipe for her cheese, and it was the way it was made in the Auvergne of France for hundreds and hundreds of years. So she created an experiment for the health department, since she was learning microbiology, and she took 2 vats of raw milk from her dairy at the convent, and she deliberately inoculated one of them. One was in wood, and one was in stainless steel. She deliberately inoculated it with E. coli, both of them, and waited 4 hours to see what would happen. And in the stainless steel vat of milk, within 4 hours, it was poison. You could not drink it. There was so much E. coli in it, it would make you sick. But in the wooden barrel, there was tiny, tiny little amount of E. coli. What happened? Well, the lactobacillus that lived in the wood, in the little grooves, because the recipe said, no, don't even clean out your barrel, just rinse it out. That white scum was full of these lactobacillus that as soon as they're exposed to milk, they break the lactose, as their name suggests, down into acids, lactic acid. And the acid kills the E. coli and makes the milk safe. So you see, the people in France for hundreds of years were practicing a kind of folk microbiology that was keeping them safe. And this is a wisdom that we lose. So it was a great lesson in how powerful traditional foods are. Sister Noella loves cheese so much that she thinks that it should be added to the Eucharist along with bread and wine. I don't know if she'll get in trouble with the Pope about this, but but that it's a better reminder of mortality, if you think about it, than what we have now.
Temos mais uma pergunta do público aqui, do Juarez Calil. Ele pergunta a você: você tem verificado o impacto do seu trabalho em políticas públicas nos Estados Unidos? Como o governo e o Congresso têm reagido ao debate que você está promovendo? Podemos esperar alguma coisa dos governos?
Well, we have to expect things from government. You know, we can vote with our forks, that's fine, and we can bring a lot of change about by supporting this alternative food economy that's rising everywhere. But there are many decisions we need the government to intervene on, and we need them to make agricultural policies that help support the right kind of agriculture. And nutrition policies that support the right kind of eating, which they're not now doing. In America, this is not because of my work, but my work is part of a movement in America, what we call the food movement, that is putting a lot of pressure on governments at the state and local and federal level. We have seen some small changes in the federal government. Obama has been a disappointment on these issues compared to what he said he was going to do. His wife, Michelle, has done some really important work elevating the profile of the issue. We've never had anyone in the White House talk about the importance of food and farming and diet to our health, and that's very important. And we have many fights over different things. And the food movement is very young and very disorganized, but it's gradually cohering, and I think will become an important political force. I think the government will discover that it needs to change now that we have something like national health care, because it's an unsustainable situation where the government is subsidizing corn sweeteners and paying for the cost of diabetes. Our government is supporting both sides in the war on type 2 diabetes. And that just can't go on. We need to align our agricultural policies with our health policies. I would point out to something very encouraging that's happening in this country that you may or may not be aware of, but your Ministry of Health is announcing in September, I think, a set of nutritional guidelines that are quite revolutionary and very progressive. They're not based on nutrients. They don't talk much about nutrients at all. They talk about the culture of food. They talk about the degree of processing. And I encourage you to look them up because they suggest another way to think about nutrition that's very tied into culture. They talk about things like cooking. So I think this way of thinking is spreading, and I'm very encouraged, and I have a lot of hope that in the future that we will look back at this period as a great mistake and reconnect with our food traditions.
Temos aqui muitas perguntas da plateia sobre a sua viagem ao Brasil, o que você comeu, comeu feijoada, se a sua avó reconheceria como comida as coisas que você está comendo aqui.
Yeah. Not my grandmother, but your grandmother. I did eat feijoada, which I loved. Even more, I liked moqueca. I had several moquecas because we were in Bahia at first, and then I had a vegetarian one here in Parachi, which was delicious. I love that idea of eating out of a pot like that, and that street food, whose name I forget. Acarajé, thank you. I had that in Salvador. That was great. I'm going to leave Brazil a bigger man than I came here as. But what impressed me is that you have one of the world's great food cultures here, and that I hope that you will defend it because they're coming to take it away. And I love it. And if cachaça is a food, I also like that.
Bom, e estamos aqui quase encerrando, e já que você falou de cachaça, eu queria lembrar uma palestra que eu vi sua no YouTube, chamada A Cannabis e a Importância do Esquecimento. Você tem aí pesquisas botânicas nessa área também? Como é?
Well, I've always been interested in things we take into our bodies that nourish our brains as well as our bodies. So I did write, I've written a couple pieces about cannabis and conducted some experiments as part of my research. And it's very interesting. I mean, we learn things about consciousness from studying drugs. I mean, drugs can be a big problem too. But they also, when you alter consciousness, you learn something about normal consciousness. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the interesting things about marijuana is that it disables short-term memory. So it teaches you something. It teaches you how important memory is to consciousness and what an enemy memory is to the sense of wonder. I mean, the funny thing about marijuana is people experience something as if for the very first time. It's like, wow, music. Carbonated water. These things become incredible because you forget everything that you knew. So, anyway, it's an interesting topic.
Muito bom. Eu agradeço muito ao Michael Pollan por essa presença.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Paulo.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you for your excellent questions. Thank you. Oh. Thank you so much.